Hi, my name is Uhuru Mofokeng and welcome to the South African Book Review Sessions, your online political book club where everything political literature is viviscated, and dissected. Guys, thank you very much for the feedback. We take every single feedback we're receiving, we take it very seriously, we consider it, and we try to apply it for the betterment of our channel. And if you have not yet subscribed, please click on the subscribe button. Subscription is for free. It doesn't come at an extra cost. What are we doing today? Today we're doing a very serious book, a book close to my heart. It's quite a sad book. It's a book that I think it should be read by basically every South African, whether black or white. The book is The Land is Ours, Advocate Thembeka Ngcukaitobi. As you can see, I'm sure you've seen this cover before. It's one of the best sellers in the country. If you have not bought it yet and you are considering whether to buy it or not, well, stick around. I'll tell you what I think about it. Now, the book is divided into three sections. The first part is about the land. It's titled The Land. The second part is titled Lawyers. That part is titled Legacies, meaning the legacies of the lawyers. Now, the lawyers the book talks about are these lawyers that you see here, and it mentions them. So, what basically is this book about? This book is about it's a story, a very sad story that basically involves or that touches every South African of every race, basically, and more especially the majority race, the African race, the black race. It is a story of dispossession. It's a story of fighting and fighting for dignity. It's a story of humiliation. Is a story of heroes. Is a story of attempts to tackle a system which was overwhelmingly powerful and probably at its zenith. It is a book about love for one's people. It is a book, it's a sad book. It's a book about basically wars and a war about land. It starts off about the physical wars, where the battlefield was the arena, where blood was shed, where men and to some extent women had to carry the cost of trying to protect the dignity of their land, of ownership over their land with their own lives. It talks of the frontier wars. It speaks in a special way about how the Xhosa's various generations under various chieftaincies, with various generals, with their own traitors, with their own villains, with their own heroes and heroines, fought against the British, and how they conquered some battles and they were defeated in a lot, in many actually, excuse me. They were defeated in many, and it speaks about that. It speaks about some of the wars fought by Dingaan. It speaks of a number of the pre-colonial wars where the blacks were fighting for the defense of having the land to their control, and not they were just fighting to avoid being colonized. And the book speaks about that. That's the first chapter of the book. It continues the issue of how, after being defeated in the battlefield, how blacks and the disadvantage of those days use the courtroom, and who were their heroes in the courtroom. That's where the lawyers come in. The lawyers were the heroes in the courtroom, and it speaks of various lawyers, and it speaks about 5 particular lawyers, the first 5 black lawyers in the country. It speaks of Henry Sylvester Williams, who was actually born in the West Indies, educated in England, and came and became the first black advocate to be admitted by the Cape Bar. Had a horrible time in South Africa, eventually left and went back to the UK. He was one of the founding fathers of the Pan-Africanist Conference, which worked side by side with Booker T. Washington, Webb Du Bois, and eventually got to shape the thinking of people like Pixley Ka Seme. It speaks of Alfred Mangena as the first black, South African born attorney, black South African, first black South African born attorney is Alfred Mangena. Now, Mangena is a very special individual because of one case he once took. He once took. The case involved 12 leaders which were fighting side by side with Bambata during the 1906 Bambata Rebellion. Now, Bambata already was killed. He had his head beheaded, and the 12 others were standing trial. Alfred Mangena was their attorney. They eventually got executed, but the arguments ran in that particular case and their magnitude and how unfair the system was towards him is mentioned in this book. It tells us about Pixley Ka Seme, and we know the role Pixley Ka Seme played in organizing the first conference of what was later to be known as the African National Congress, and he eventually became his president. It speaks of a lot, and it speaks of a particular issue of his presidency. It does state that Pixley Ka Seme later on became the president in the 1930s, and how much horrible his presidency was. But then it speaks of a very particular strategic point which assisted the ANC to survive the tumultuous time of the 30s, when it had fierce competition from an organization called the All Africa Convention, the AAC. Now, it tells of how the AAC was popular and how the ANC was dwindling in its support and popularity under the leadership of Pixley, and how Pixley managed to be always a step ahead of the AAC, even though the ANC was at this time an affiliate of the AAC, and how the ANC managed to outlive the AAC because of a strategic decision taken by Seme. It speaks especially on the lawyers and the various traditional houses. They all represent, most of them represented. For example, when it came to Richard Msimang was known to have represented Sopuza at a stage along with Pixley Ka Seme. He was known to have represented one of the royal houses in Rhodesia, in the Ndebeleland now, the Ndebeleland then. He was the legal representative, and another George Monsiwa was the legal representatives of the Barolong tribe in northwest, that side of Mofokeng. Pixley Ka Seme was the legal advisor also of Sopuza and the house of Dingizayo at that side of the Zulu of Zululand. So these were individuals who were the heroes of the poor people, the blacks by that time, who were being dispossessed of their land at a seriously alarming rate. Now, these were people who were there. Some of them were already practicing. Most of them were already practicing when the 1913 land was implemented. Even before then, when the 1910 Act of Union came to implementation, some of these chaps wrote intensively and argued against the exclusion of the Africans in their own land while they were the majority. They argued against the exclusion of Africans in the voters' roll in other provinces, though the Cape Province did provide some of these lawyers, like Ngcubu Phoswayo was on the voters' roll because the Cape was rather lenient to a particular class of Africans who qualified for who qualified to vote, and the requirements for them to vote were rather ludicrous because they didn't apply to whites. And for a black man to be eligible to vote in the Cape, he had to be rather an exclusive chap. He had to do some sort of work, have some sort of property, and bring in a particular income on a yearly basis. And it means comrades like Ngcubu Phoswayo met that particular criteria. So this is a story of land dispossession. It starts at the first with the battlefield as the arena of fighting for the land, and it moves to the courts as the arena of fighting for the land, because it talks of how it tells you of the legislation and gets into deeper details of the legislation that was put, who advocated for the legislation, what was the thinking behind the legislation, how it affected black people, how did they react, what did the lawyers do. It's big. Most of these chaps who put themselves in the cause of poor people died poor. Richard Msimang died an alcoholic. Alfred Mangena died poor. Pixley died poor. The only person here who at least died relatively, the two people who died relatively well were George Mountsia and Ngcubu Phoswayo, because of the closeness to traditional houses. And you know, traditional houses and royal houses by then were the only source of income for black leaders. If you were a black leader, you'd be a chief and you'd get some sort of income, and you had to be obedient in a way to the state, because if you were not, they would take away those benefits. These guys represented many traditional houses in their quest to fight for the land. It's a story that is very sad, because had the land not underwent the transfer from the hands of the majority to the hands of the minority, most of these atrocities we see in the country would not be as they are. They would not as be there. The book tells you of how the land was transferred from the hands of the majority to the hands of the minority, using the battlefield at first and using the courtroom later on. So it tells you of the attempts and the various means employed by blacks during those days, during the early 20th century and the late 19th century, to actually during the early 19th century, in a quest of actually fighting the colonialism as is presented to the people that they governed, and unto themselves a big threat. So this to me is a fantastic book. It is a book that I think it should be read by everyone. The information is too vast. It will always be relevant. Whenever you are bored, you can reread it. It's readable. You will always find something new, like you might have missed something. You'll always pick up something new. One other interesting thing about most of these lawyers, except for Henry Williams and to some extent Ngcubu Phoswayo, most of these four other lawyers, meaning Alfred Mangena, Seme, Msimang, and Mountsia, they were all members of the African National Congress. They played a critical role in assembling the African National Congress. They knew each other to some extent. They were friends. They worked together in some cases. They worked together in drafting the constitution of the African National Congress. They worked together in keeping the records of the African National Congress. before of the South African Native National Congress from in 1912 up until 1923. So it proves that it also tells a story of how the law profession is not just a noble profession, but a revolutionary profession as well. It challenges lawyers to always have those cases that will challenge the status quo. You see, the state might be governed by the African National Congress, but then if you are a lawyer and you read this book, you would get motivated that it is not wrong for you to challenge the state today, because it has always been a tool. Today, we are supposed to use the state as a tool to transform the position of a black individual, because of the state was used as a tool to transform the very same position of a black individual from being an owner of land to being a second-class citizen. It tells you of how of laws that were of how the 1913 Land Act had clauses that gave people an ultimatum that it's either they leave the land they've been occupying for generations, or else they transform themselves to being workers, cheap labor for the farms. It tells of how the courtrooms and how laws were used to not only dispossess blacks of the land, but then to force blacks into cheap labor, and thus build an economy of only a certain type of people with a certain type of pigmentation. It's a very sad story. It's painful. It speaks of serious hardships of our forefathers and our leaders of many generations ago. It is also an indictment to today's activists to actually make sure that the issue of land must be addressed as soon as possible. The more we sit and we relax over this land issue, we'll have a crisis. And why am I wearing the ANC t-shirt today? I'm wearing the ANC t-shirt because, you see, you cannot read this book and not find the ANC. It tells you of how the ANC was part of the first instruments used by the Africans as a collective to fight against exclusion by the Act of Union, to fight against dispossession of land by the 1913 Land Act. It is a book that reminds us that the ANC is a tool of the people. It belongs to the people. The people use the African National Congress to fight for their causes. The African National Congress is not a money-making scheme for a few. The African National Congress, it is not a tool, or it is not a way of catapulting oneself to positions of elitism within society, but then it is an instrument of the masses to agitate and change the status quo. Today, the ANC is in government, and what it says as its primary pillar is the transformation of the state. The state ought to be transformed to favor the poor, the marginalized, and the historically disadvantaged through the dispossessions of land. The blacks in general, the Africans in particular, and blacks in general. Comrades, I highly recommend this book. I love this book. It's a fantastic book. If you are not a lawyer, you might have a bit of a struggle reading this book, though. You might have a problem because there's a lot of legal jargon. It's written by a lawyer who loves the profession. It's written about law, mostly about lawyers. It's written about how laws were enacted to disadvantage others and how others use the courts and challenge the same laws. So there's a lot of legal jargon. So if you are not familiar with the legal jargon, you might struggle reading this book. you might struggle reading this book. And that is why, because of that, that's the only disadvantage I find in this book. From 0 to a 10, how would I rate this book? I'd rate it a good 7. I would rate it perhaps above that had it been written in simpler language, but it's not written in simpler language. It has a lot of legal language and a lot of technical language, so it makes it difficult for someone who's not been to a law class, or who's not been to a courtroom, or who's not familiar with legal proceedings to actually read this book. But besides that, it's a fantastic book. It's a must-have. I've read it once, I will read it again, and I've been reading it now, and I'm not bored. I'm actually interested in going deeper, because it feels like it's the first time I read it. It's that good. It's that good. And for me, it's that good because I've been to law school, and that's not that. I'm a law dropout. I'm a law university dropout. So for me, it was not a challenge reading this book. But if you've not been to an LLB class, yeah, you're going to struggle again. But besides that, it's a fantastic book. I'd give it a 7, and I'd say buy this book. It was out a couple of years ago. It's still quite affordable. Get it and read it, and you'll share your views with me. If you've read this book, please share your views with me. And I think it's a fantastic book. I think it's a great book. I love the way the man wrote the book. A good 7 would fit it. And guys, get the book. The book does remember, it's not a question, is the land ours? No, the book tells you the land is ours, and it does prove. This is evidence. This is what you call empirical evidence that land was dispossessed unfairly by using the courts, and battles were fought in the battlefield and in the courtroom, the ANC being one of the heroes, these lawyers being at the forefront of those battles, with many kings and royal houses supporting the cause. It's a beautiful story about loss, dispossession, humiliation, and an attempt to fight back at a enemy with serious strength. An incredible book about loss, about what a book, guys. Get this book, read this book. It's important. Everyone